progress that's been made, right? And that is definitely the case, that a great deal of progress was made, and I believe that, I think Paul said something, effectively that 98% of Californians have access to clean drinking water. You know, again, that's a remarkable thing, and we do want to start from that perspective. He also wrote that and I think these last two bullet points are mesh nicely with where we ended the last conversation, right? Which is that from his perspective, these kind of convenings are very important, and we really do need to have more of them. He in particular, given that I didn't know this, but it turns out that he was a major, I think, an English major in college, so he emphasized the social and humanistic aspects of these conversations as well. To really have a broader understanding, right, of the implications, the social, political, and economic implications of water quality measurement and water management more generally. So that's, generally speaking, Akeem's higher level perspectives in this field. Some of the things that I wrote down in terms of the notes that I took after that policymaker session, to just kind of go back and touch base with some of those themes. The new tools that were talked about quite a bit yesterday are obviously incredibly powerful, right? They're shedding great insights into water quality and water use of California and other parts of the United States and also worldwide. But they do have some concerns and questions about the use of these tools. And I think these are more generally the types of things we hear these days about AI, big data, and more generally. That, you know, they really do want us as a scientific community to think more about, you know, how can we make the use of these kinds of data, big data, AI, remote sensing, more transparent, more open, and more accessible to the public and to stakeholders. More generally. That is a challenge. It's not a challenge, again, that's restricted to this area, but it's a challenge more generally. They noted also that there's a more continued need for ground truthing, right, of the remote sensing data. There is work that's being done on that. Obviously, a lot of that data is ground truth, but they really do sense a need for more ground truthing of these data. Paul and Joaquin also talked about the need for the scientific community to really better educate the public and stakeholders about the use and understanding of remote sensing data, and also, you know, analyses that use these large data sets that are, you know, employing tools like machine learning and AI, which themselves are not necessarily open and transparent. And there was quite a bit of talk yesterday in various presentations about, you know, a greater need, especially for those of us like myself who study political communications more generally, to really figure out, you know, how do we better communicate with the public about these measures. They're complicated, right? Most people don't know much about chemistry, biology. So figuring out how we communicate the measures and the implications of the measures to the public is I think, something that they found as an important area for conversation. And I think, I can't remember who it was yesterday, it might have been you who brought up the notion of storytelling, right? That using these data and to figure out how to tell the story about water quality and some of the problems with water quality better with these kinds of data is an important topic. Paul, you know, he talked about his need for the tricorder, right? I know that's kind of funny, but it is something. He actually brought this up when I talked to him a couple of weeks ago on Zoom as well. That, you know, he and the people who are really on the ground measuring water quality from a regulatory perspective do want the scientific community to keep developing more tools that are better, faster, and cheaper. He talked quite a bit about the cost. So thinking about tools that are better, faster, cheaper, and building his tricorder, that would be really pretty cool. So those are some key challenges for the scientific community. And finally, we really do need to keep developing measures for some of the emerging problems. That, you know, Bruce brought this up yesterday. We had some conversations about emerging problems, new things that are going to be issues, and trying to perhaps mitigate these before they become concerns is an important problem from a regulator perspective. Am I missing anything? Is there things that you all thought that from the policymaker perspective, we need to take note of? Is there something that I'm missing here that I should make sure we get down, because we are going to try to write some kind of short summary report? Anything anybody heard that you want to get into the record yet?
That from the folks working at the local level, we are, from Orange County and from MWD, and we didn't hear from the tiny little systems that don't have access to the expertise and the tools, right? The expensive tools that are available to Orange County and MWD. And so I guess it just emphasizes your last point about cost and the ease of use, and becomes even more salient for lower capacity communities and smaller systems.
Thank you. Others? Now that I've figured out how to type.
I would mention just one thing about community engagement that wasn't necessarily brought up yesterday, but I think relates to policy perspectives. There's a way to sort of continue to create measurement and further the scientific community while engaging like on the ground, especially very local and remote communities in that. And one example is, for example, the native village of Kotzebue. They are experts in bearded seals. And so they have sort of navigated to be sort of the caretakers of bearded seal research. So anyone that's studying that in the Arctic Ocean and looking at, shipping routes and impacts of XYZ have to actually partner with them and do work with them. And it's made it so that the local community is not sidestepped in creating the measurement and the scientific research. And I think in some of these, especially critical zones or like, areas that are very vulnerable and very remote, and have this long-standing generational knowledge of some of these systems, it's important to try to add that community engagement part where possible. So that's not remote sensing, but maybe in terms of just engagement in general.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
I just build on that with there's in the tribes hold a different type of data set in their storytelling and so I think finding ways to marry traditional ecological knowledge from tribes and Western science could be a really great way to leverage that knowledge that isn't really connected in the same, collected and transmitted in the same way that Western science is. And so one thing that comes to mind is the big band Pomo Indian tribe in California on Clear Lake. They have a whole EPA department that looks at eutrophication water quality concerns in Clear Lake, and they have all this knowledge there. And a lot of times their voices aren't being heard in the local decision-making processes. So that's just one example of there's a lot of tribes everywhere. So being able to leverage their voice and also have that environmental justice aspect incorporated into the research.
And there's a lot of funding for that right now, actually, through the America the Beautiful funds and other things through the Biden administration to fund incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge.
And the buzzword for that, if you want to go to NSF, is co-creation of knowledge and co-design. So parentheses, co-creation of knowledge and co-design.
I think that's going to be back up there. Co-creation?
Yeah, co-creation of knowledge and co-design of solution with community. Co-creation of knowledge should be fine, yeah, okay. And co-design.
Solutions.
Excellent, thank you.
We didn't hear from anyone from the public here either too, so and there's a gap that we've been talking about in many different aspects, but one of them is how a lot of these policies affect the public on the ground once they're implemented. Kind of like when I would put a local water body on advisory, we'd go out and put up signs. And one time, one instance that sticks in my mind is when I went out, we were putting up signs to say, stay out of the water, there's a harmful algal bloom here. And a mom continued to let her infants play and splash around in the harmful algal bloom. I was trying to convey the danger, and she said, look, I don't have childcare. They're not in school. I don't have air conditioning. I don't have anywhere else to go. This is a rural part of the state. So that told me that we're doing a needs to be convinced of this of that in this room, but there's a knowledge gap there as well, and then understanding that you know, environmental equity and justice is a key factor in these higher level policies that go on as well.
All right.
So, I'm not sure how to formulate this, but Hal may know more about this. At some point, about 15 years ago in China, there was a fair amount of water quality monitoring done by people doing measurements and sending them to a lab. And the central government was pretty happy with this because they were having a hard time getting local officials to monitor the water quality. So the question is there a deeper level of community engagement that can be somehow paired with things like Pico Corona's iNaturalist, which is a way in which you spot species because with that iPhone can actually upload their location and the thing that they've seen. So the question is, if we're thinking about water quality and this issue about data, is there a way to do community engagement that's a completely different thing, where people are collecting samples or something like that? So I don't know how to put this, but this is and I'm not sure Joaquin and Paul would agree both to this idea. Joaquin might be interested in this, Paul might not, right? I'm just saying Paul is the example person who is running the water monitoring system for a district. I think the regulator would be very happy to have extra data that's not just simply coming from this intermediary called the MWP, right? So I don't know how to put this, but
So actually, the way to put it is citizen science.
Thank you. See, there are people who know what I'm talking about. I know.
Citizen science.
NOAA has an app where you can report water quality straight within that.
So usually you don't include citizens, but undergrad students who are in a class project, they go to different water bodies and they collect the water sample and do this, and they can share this information, and it's an enormous amount of information.
So there are many examples of citizen science, like at Caltech, the water splitting center that Harry Gray and others developed. So they develop these kits and then send it to high school teachers, training, send it. So they all been collecting those data about, you know, like hits. So they use it to develop, you know, new material. So it's when you put this proposal together, citizen science is really something to build, you know, an outreach program around it, and at the same time get useful data. So yeah, that is important. Thank you for bringing that.
One of the things I'd like to hear a little bit more about is something that my group spends a lot of time on. That's financial capability assessment. Even though the feds have put out some policies on that, when it comes to the state, although they give it lip service, they really don't have any funding for it. So when we're looking at the smaller communities, they don't have the wherewithal to clean up their water, or to capture the stormwater, or to even be able to pass on the rates, if you like, to their rate payers. And for some of the smaller communities, just South Pasadena, for example, I have owned some property down there, the rates are going up 3 times what they are today. And people are saying, where's this coming from? You know, why are you dunning me? The elephant in the room, in my opinion, in terms of a lot of water quality, is indeed funding. We need massive amounts of funding. If we're really going to capture stormwater, for example, which for Southern California is absolutely key, we're going to need a lot more than Measure W. Right now, Measure W is about $280 million a year, and that is a proverbial drop in the bucket at this point in time. Don't mean to get on my soapbox.
Well, funding is funding is a perennial issue. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, whenever you get a bunch of academics in a room, we're all going to start complaining about funding. So back, yep.
I just wanted to say something going back to the citizen science and crowdsourcing data collection, just to be, I guess, and the idea of terminology for a minute. So there is a sort of a debate that I think is actually kind of maybe sort of settled at this point about whether or not you should use the term citizen science or community science because of the question of citizenship and what that means to particular kinds of like undocumented people. So that's something that I think generally it's better to not use the word citizen. And that's,
Point well taken.
yeah. The other thing I was going to say is just the crowdsourcing. That's another thing where there's some concern among sort of vulnerable communities, that that knowledge is being extracted from them. So I think that that's something where this idea of partnership has to be kind of thought about in a more sensitive way.
How's that?
Great.
Okay. Yeah.
I guess I wanted to build on the comments around, needing financial capability assessment, and just to note that a lot of our attention has been thinking about the measurement challenges of water quality, but really for all the questions that we've been asking around, well, what are the things that are causing water quality problems and what are the impacts of those problems? We need also, there's tons of measurement challenges in demographics and institutions and economics and health impacts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and many of those I think overlap with the challenges that we were talking about specifically on water quality, in terms of some places where there's tons of data and others where there's not, and the challenges of the aggregate data versus the granularity, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, not thinking about, if we just got this, this sort of the natural science, if you will, right, then everything else will solve itself. There's still all these other pieces to the puzzle.
Okay. Does that sound about right? Does that encapsulate? That's an excellent point. Yeah, it's not just measuring the outcomes. We need to make sure that we're measuring all these other features that are going to be critically important for understanding water quality and water usage. Yeah.
One thing we didn't hear much about was domestic wells, building on the small systems. That is where we see most of our nitrate violations, for example, because of capacity. But we don't hear much about domestic wells. It's hard to get information about private, we call it domestic wells in Oregon, but wells at a house, small systems that are not captured by the public water supply, not covered by the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so those are data gaps. There's only 3 states in the country that have any kind of requirement to measure, and Oregon is one of them. So I have a data set, and we look at national predictions and compare it to, what's going on in those private wells. But just, how do we get more closely aligned to the private wells?
Excellent.
So I have a general question about measurement and modeling. I mean, we cannot measure our way out of these, right? I mean, I'm looking at PFAS, right? I mean, we have very limited measurement, and they have different chemical behavior. To extrapolate their, fate and transport, we really need to develop and validate models. So then, how do we really link measurement and model is really important.
Measurement and
Modeling, yeah. Whether it's a AI model, whether it's physical model, right? But that's something that we need to think about it in the context of water quality.
we're starting to drift away from the policymakers, so let me just put this on the side. No, it's fine.
Oh,
We
okay.
don't want to lose this, right?
I'd like to build on that, and I'll link it back to the policy, because I 100% agree that we can't measure our way out of this, and there's also an opportunity cost, or in proceeding in this direction of trying to get really accurate data. I personally feel like we already know a lot of what's not working, who's the disadvantaged communities that are disproportionately being impacted, and ultimately, this is like a political will issue. A lack of funding, getting administrative changes to make laws that exist more effective. And so, like, when I think about, like, how do we get us to move in the right direction, I feel like we have to have more research done on kind of like how much is it costing society to defer these issues versus taking a more preventative or precautionary approach, or that kind of comes in with like the storytelling. I feel like if we could focus more of our research on that, we can get the decision makers to do the right thing, and then we can be on that path towards achieving sustainability and promote and clean water and ensuring things. But ultimately, it's all of this is a political will challenge, and even the technologies exist for purifying water, for measuring water, but to get these things deployed, And to use this data effectively, ultimately the stopgap is policy making or implementation. So.
Okay, so this is a call for David's research agenda.
Yeah.
Right. Seriously, it's like measuring the social cost, right?
Yeah.
The kind of work that Anna does, and so we just want to phrase that as like, yes, again, we go back to we need an NSF center for this, or what's the right way to summarize this?
I guess it's measuring the social cost, it's also communicating it. In some places, measuring it in terms of the dollar value and communicating in terms of the dollar value matters, but in other places, you want the narratives and the stories. I think it's part of what
Yeah.
all of it.
And it also touches on Joaquin's point yesterday about the precautionary principle, and that's just not how we operate with water regulation, and what is needed to get from where we are now somewhere closer to there.
Do I want to say regulation / pollution contamination? What is that? How do you want to refer to it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would
It's-
say also
yeah.
like rights laws too, like how rights are like the institutional component, not just the regulation, but.
I'm not sure. I was focusing on my typing skills. Can you say that? Repeat that, please?
Sure, I was saying not just the water regulation / pollution, but also like the framework, like the laws around how water rights are doled out.
It's like almost like we need to make sure that any research that's being done, that there's like a solution or like a take-home message for the policymakers, right? And a lot of times we spend a lot of time talking about the problems. This is describing the problems, but sometimes policymakers are extremely busy. They need to know okay, what's actionable? What can I do? How much is that going to cost? Is this politically favorable? And yeah, so it's just it needs to be. I feel like we need to kind of hone in on that more, spend more time, because it's just the situation's pretty not great in a lot of places.
So, I guess sort of, I'm kind of waiting for Megan and Bruce to jump up and down because I'm too tired. Kevin, you're happy to know. So, here's the issue. To me, this water quality issue is an incredibly distributed conflict. So, water rights have been apportioned to some people who have claims to certain sets of sources of water, some of which are pretty good and pretty cheap, some of which are pretty bad, which means they're expensive once you clean them. And as somebody was saying, we don't have maps of the districts because, in particular in California, there's successions of waves of some things are municipal, some things are special districts, some things are, right? So anything that we try to do has distributional consequences, and the politics of this distribution is really important, right? So we have a completely irrational water system in California because we allocated rights locally and then we prevented trade, but now there's lots of people who don't want trade because that may affect where they're at, right? And so I think that we have to be a bit more judicious than think that there's some social welfare goal, but that if we could understand the social welfare and maximization policy, this is going to happen.
Yeah.
I think we need to be really grounded in this is going to matter to these people for that reason, this is going to matter to these people for that reason. So your example of the mother who wants to let her kids play in bad water, or my mother who had us drink out of a private well for my entire childhood in the middle of actual fields. She wasn't going to go out and, nobody going to pay for piped water in from the city. It was too far away. So the distributional consequences of any adjustments are going to be paramount. And whether that's Megan's story about this initial allocation of federal money, everything we talk about, we're going to hit this. And with water, because it's a local technology to start with, it's particularly bad news.
But we get moments in time, and right now is one of them, where we get huge infusions of capital, right? And so, I am just a huge fangirl of David and Hannah's research agendas, and at the same time, for the next 5 years, the federal government's throwing so much money at water, and how do we also have measurements that provide immediate feedback, so that if EPA continues to be spending next year, we can provide information that allows incremental adjustment. Or if the water board is gonna be spending some more money next year, that we can provide little incremental adjustment, because there's 98%, right, that are getting clean water, but then there's 2% aren't, right? And we wanna make sure that the funds flow to those communities too. So it's, I agree completely, so much is sticky,
But once you
and there's moments for like opportunity to kind of, you know, bend it a little bit.
But do the 98% care about the 2%? That's another way to put my question is, I think we are in a polarized world. I think Bruce told us something about that yesterday, and I think we should never forget that that's the world we live in. And a lot of these, farming in the Central Valley, we could solve most water demand problems in south of the Tehachapi's by just buying water from the Central Valley at a relatively low price. There are some people who don't want that to happen, for completely logical reasons on their part. I think, I'm not saying, I think these problems are solvable. We should have that embedded in whatever we do that is going to go and talk to policymakers, because they know this. They know that that's where their constituents are going to be coming back to them. And so we should not be naive about that, that's all. It's not,
And I just wanna edit that last point. I don't think we need to keep research focused. I think we need to have both agendas going, right? Like, absolutely, we need the really well specified, super hard questions that look at long-term consequences and grapple with all the complicated identification problems and measurement problems. Like, we totally need that. And try to come to agreement on the social science version of the, little gadget that's gonna tell us something quickly and help us bend the curve a little bit.
Yeah, and that is in some ways, I think, a very more specific way of saying, let's keep the research policy relevant.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
both.
right, keep it policy relevant, make sure.
So
that
I'm
we're
gonna
doing
throw
things
in
to
here
ensure
a
that
term.
policymakers know what we're doing.
We have, this is great, we have a lot of people here, science, engineering, technology, policy. So I'm gonna throw in a term that we use often called convergence. If you look at water, it's very fragmented. Even NSF, we have like different division programs. The federal government has 17 agencies. So to really move forward, the community, we need to converge science, engineering, technology, and policy to address water challenges. They are so broad, we need to focus. I mean, are we going to focus on nutrients? Are we going to focus on PFAS? You cannot have a center that look at all of these things. So you need to have convergence in a way that everything is integrated to deliver a specific recommendation, policy. So that's kind of like where to look at. Maybe, some subgroup to start looking at, focus area where they are ready to be converged to really advance a specific goal. I'm just thinking out loud, maybe I'm not making sense.
No, you're making perfect sense, and then when you said that, to be honest, one of the things I just thought of was like the NSF Convergence Accelerator Program.
Exactly.
David's idea for, having some kind of big program could actually be a convergence accelerator program.
Yeah, that's exact. This is where this group can come up with ideas that are focused enough but converge and then move them forward.
Exactly.
For NSF, those are the things that are usually more successful. If you want to build a big center that's like too broad, typically you'll get pushback. But if you identify an area where you bring everybody and really make a leap forward, those are typically have the best chance of really being picked up.
I think it's a great point, and it's great to know that from the NSF funding mechanism. And I think the tricky thing with water is just that it's so, the problems are so spatially heterogeneous. And so I'm coming from the east where like water quantity is not as big of an issue. So it's water quality, here in the west, water quantity as well as water quality. And so trying to think about, what would be the right topic and thing to kind of hit on and address in terms of water quality maybe would be a great thing just to hear from others as we're here. I mean, we don't have to do it right now, I know we're doing this, but like if we had to pick a list of the 3 top things on water, maybe everyone could write it down on a piece of paper and turn it in at the end, and we could do a little word bubble. I think it'd be super interesting just to see that. But I do think going back to the point on this issue of like, what do we do with this though, like the consequences of this. I think it's just this is a separate issue now, but it's just such an excellent point. And you know, in the state of Massachusetts, private well owners don't want to test for PFAS now, because you get a hit on PFAS and you're potentially, now you have to disclose that to future buyers of your home, and you're running the risk of losing a significant fraction of one of the most valuable assets that you own. And you know, farmers in Iowa, you know, I focus on nutrient issues in Iowa. I think it's super important, but you know, farmers in Iowa are going to also have potentially real consequences if you start measuring more information on nitrates. And so I think, I'm not a political scientist, but I certainly think that that's such a super important issue here, is trying to understand what are the potential consequences of measurement for the involved stakeholders. And thinking through, like, what does that look like in terms of helping people adjust to those consequences of measurement, I think is a really important question, and something that maybe we don't do the best job on.
Kind of related to what John Around.
So, absolutely, like just to,
very related
yeah,
ideas, but let me just get it.
building off of that point.
Yeah.
So maybe rather than thinking about top 3 issues, maybe think about
Now, this
what
was
are the
homework.
cross-cutting challenges.
This was homework. You
Yeah.
wanted you to write down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, seriously, got it.
Yeah, cross-cutting challenges, right?
You want challenges.
Yeah, like challenges, like if you look at, you said Massachusetts, maybe you don't, water quantity is not an issue, right? California things, right? So it's very hard to address all of those geographic, but if you look at everything across, say, what are the cross-cutting challenges that this community that wants to come together, converge science, engineering, technology, policy, is it, I mean, whatever. I mean, this is where the social scientists, like, what in this water quality issue, what are, I think that's how to start building this discussion. And a center proposal, as it takes a long time, but maybe you can start thinking about these cross-cutting challenges, maybe have some, you know, local group workshop. I'm just thinking out loud, it may not make sense, but this is where a center from an NSF perspective could have transformative impact, where if you solve those cross-cutting challenges, you can address different problem, whether it's quantity, quality, their intersection, environmental justice, but you cannot do it all.
And I just exercise my editorial ability to say, let's not forget that we need better data.
Yeah.
Could you just insert that like every 5th bullet?
Yeah, but that would exceed my PowerPoint abilities.
You can go back and do it later.
I can figure out some way to get the generative AI to do that for me.
More informative data, right? Isn't that you, Hannah?
Yeah.
Well, better, more informative. I don't know. I do think we need better, more.
Better is nice and vague.
Can I get back to David's?
Yes, get back to David's point.
David's point and so one version of this is what water quality means and what those challenges are localized, right? So on Cape Cod it may be sea level rise, which is in Massachusetts, that's too much water.
Good.
Right? In certain other areas it's going to be, in certain parts of California it's going to be too rapid snowmelt. I don't know if that's snowmelt is a quality or a quantity issue, but it's certainly something that is ecologically variable. So it seems to me the question is if we come back together at some point, whether we are trying to find 3 things, nitrates, phosphorus, and PFAS, we're going to work on these 3 things because we understand something about their chemistry, and they're global. Right? We don't have to worry about it. Every 50 miles, there's a number of people that are doing something that is affecting these things. Or we're really thinking about the more localized issue where we bring a bunch of people together that are all facing slightly different versions of the problems, and at some point, out of that comes a knowledge that says each place has its own challenge. We're going to recognize those challenges. We're going to try to figure out how to do things. You know, what I'm trying to think about is this local versus picking 3 things that we think are big problems. Sorry.
I guess building on this, so I think that there are ways to aggregate up from the local, and so there's this idea of archetypes where you try to say, okay, we've got all of these individual places all dealing with their own problems, But then there's like, you can do this in a, in a statistically, data grounded manner, or you can do it sort of just by comparing challenges, but of saying, these are places that are facing a similar suite of stuff. And so, I've got some work right now looking at identifying wildfire archetypes, and we're actually seeing that wildfire spread is relatively similar if you're looking at the Great Basin in Nevada and like the Everglades in Florida. Two places that you would not think should talk to each other, but actually they might be able to learn from each other because of these similarities. And so I think there's ways that we could think about, okay, is it broad slices of urban versus agricultural, or are there actual like, oh no, there's these, deeper classifications perhaps in terms of the type of water quality problem, the type of the demographics, the local industry, et cetera, that we can start to group things or less.
Sticky institutions, right?
I guess as a scientist engineer, I'm thinking about that same kind of concept, but from a different way. I think it was one of David's slides that was like the flow chart from the different pollutants that we can measure through the various different ways that they affect the environment and intersect with one another over to those eventual end causes. And somewhere in there, there's a set of sort of technical questions about what are the things we need to measure in order to be able to figure out that cost transfer, but also what are the things we can measure to inform sort of the regulation on stopping the emissions of those things versus treating them downstream. And those are also a different set of archetypes, right? Like there's a set of problems that may only exist in part of the country or may exist in all of the country, but are going to be different because of the source they come from, the process they move through the environment, and then the impact that they have on human behavior. And I think there are broad trends that are already fairly well established, but that we can define a little more clearly with points where a well-placed measurement could help inform that flow chart, right?
So I'm a member of the public. I do not work in this field. And one thing that I think is missing here is taking into account how elected officials make decisions and put it into, somehow insert this in the election cycle. How do we convince the public from an emotional perspective that water quality and quantity here in California is important, and they should look and also convince elected officials or candidates that this should be on their agenda? Because I don't see that. I sometimes look at the election, what is it called, educational information. No one in LA will talk about that water quality. And even in Kern County, those who are running only talk about quantity. And I think that's a missing part from the public and sort of government interaction. And then perhaps the scientific community and political science community can do a little better in educating one of these parties or both.
Just to add to that real quick, it's fascinating you say that, because it's interesting that there isn't more focus and attention on it, because if you look at Gallup polls for the last several decades, surface and drinking water quality are two of the top two listed top priorities when it comes to worries about the environment. It exceeds air pollution, it exceeds endangered species, it has exceeded climate change for a long time. I don't know if it still does, but there's at least the public is reporting that these are super important concerns, and it's kind of interesting that politicians haven't picked up on it as much. But I'm not a political scientist, so.
It's interesting because I have a lot of well-educated friends with PhDs and work in this sort of high scientifically important domains, and I'm the one bringing up the issue of water quantity and quality. I'm the one who's trying to educate them how important these things are. And maybe it's because we live in a rich area, a very affluent area, that they don't think about it. But there is, as we said, the disconnect.
I have to pipe in here because I have a bunch of research on this question, and the two things that I'll jump to the punchline system performs well.
Mhm.
And second, they worry a lot about passing costs on to their
Mhm.
ratepayers.
Yeah, well,
They
we can-
worry a lot, so even when they see problems, they talk about seniors, and they worry about seniors on fixed incomes
Mhm.
paying more for water, for any water service.
Well, yeah, LA County will be a lot more for water starting very soon.
Yeah, but those are the two things that you hear most strongly.
So I wanna just take a step back, cause Jenny, you said after the social science panel that like, your field is going like this, our field is going like this, we're interested in the same questions, but not talking to each other, so that's exactly why we wanted to bring this group together, is like, we know that we're duplicating effort, we know that we would probably make faster progress if we were able to make these connections, but it's really hard to find where to start. So do you have kind of experience that educates like how you begin to foster those partnerships, and, or is it really just like putting in the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to ask each other that question, you know, I think it's, part of it is just finding the right people, and part of it is money and time, just like everything. You know, if we don't have funding to say, I want you to work with me on this topic, but I have, you know, you like USGS often, you know, they, like the water science centers, so for Sparrow, they put all of the water quality portal data together to run Sparrow. And so, but they don't necessarily have the time, because they require funding in order to work with somebody on something. And so there are some barriers institutionally, but I think, you know, finding the right people, putting the right people together, and providing some either scientific or financial incentives, you know, funding for a postdoc, like the Powell Center is a great example where we have postdocs that can work with folks on different topics, but I think we have to figure out good ways for us to come together and figure out what our mutual, like our personal incentives are for doing research, and also our institutional incentives, like what does EPA want to see come out of this, or what does, you know, different organizations see as coming out of this. But I definitely see some things moving in a positive direction, but I think, you know, setting out the question of how do we, I mean, really for me, fundamentally a question is, how do we track progress? Like, how do we answer the questions of how we spend all this money and we're doing these things, and how do we track progress? There was a great paper by Emily Bernhardt about 15 years ago on how we don't track like we do all this restoration and we don't measure it very well. It's a great paper, it's been cited many, many times. I can point it to people, I can't remember exactly, maybe 2009 with Margaret Palmer. And I feel like we're still there. 15 years later, we still have not learned the lesson from Emily, who says many wise things. We haven't figured out how to, you know, how do we come together as even a federal community to answer these questions? Because we got USDA, we've got EPA, we've got USGS, we've got the 17 other organizations, you know, federal agencies that track water. You know, how do we come together? So I don't know, I'm asking more questions than I'm answering, but I think it's a team effort, and just putting the right putting the right team of people together, but also multiple teams maybe asking different parts of the same question. So I don't know if that's helpful, but.
No, it is, and I think, in response to that, I'm gonna assign you all more homework than Dave, which is if you saw a talk and you were like, oh, that person's really missing the point, you know, we think about it this way in my field, please like go up to them at lunch or email them afterwards and tell them that, because that's the whole point why we're here, is that we know sometimes that we're like moving in opposite directions, and so please make those connections, and also if you think that somebody would benefit from working with somebody else in your network, please try and make those connections.
Yeah, I agree, and just to editorialize again, as Bruce brought up yesterday, I have a lot of experience working in the area of election administration, election technology, and I can tell you that fostering these kind of collaborations in that space has proved a lot more challenging than I sense will be true here. Because there's a lot more fundamental distrust between the people who run elections in the US and the academic community for various reasons that I won't go into. I can go into, but I won't go into. And there's also politics that intrudes into that conversation in ways that it hasn't really intruded yet. Bruce is worried about this, I know. But you know, I think keeping that at bay, right, to foster these kind of collaborations is going to be very important. Keeping the partisanship out of it is going to be very important for building these kind of ties in this community. So I'm actually somewhat optimistic that we can make more progress than we have over the last 25 years in the area of election administration. Support.
Just on that note, wanted to mention something minor because we don't want to like reinvent the wheel. I know it's a nascent entity, but there's some. Does anyone work with the Internet of Water? Yeah. So there's this. There have been efforts to try to create this aggregation and harmonization of data from different entities. It started under, I believe, the Obama administration, and now is housed in Duke. It's very early stages, and I know that I believe it was initially developed also in part with the Lincoln Institute. And I know also at JPL, there's the Western Water Applications Office, and also, of course, Western States Water Council has been involved in this. But there are some, I agree with David that we need like big effort in this harmonization, but also there are some entities that have been starting that, and so it would be good to like, you know, see how we can collaborate with them too.
So like, I think what we need to know from this room is, what are the three low-hanging fruits? That some harmonization could produce, you know, that we could say to people, look, if we do this on these data sets, we really get a big bang for our buck. Or this, we can address this. So this goes back to, you know, David, what are you most frustrated about? What's the, you know, what's $100,000, or what is 4 people working for 3 months on this thing could actually really, you know, if we come back in a year, what are the things that we really, really great to sort of be able to say we could actually make progress on this. There's some really complicated things. There's got to be some that are just like these things that are missing. I'm not turning to you as you have to answer this question. I just think all of us should think about what are things that the collaboration could produce.
Yeah, so just along the same line, after that, one thing that's very helpful, if you want to go for an NSF center, you really have to have preliminary results. So one thing is to find private foundations that can provide seed money for these groups to work to get the preliminary result. Might as well be as harmonizing the data, showing something. That I think that's the first step. I mean, if you just go to an NSF Now center, it's going to be like, the review is like, okay, how long you've been doing this? I mean, there is now a process of planning grant. You can apply if you want to go for an ERC. Now it's like a planning grant, which is so. But you need to show at the beginning that this community has been working around and having 3 low-hanging fruit, some seed investment to get something going would be very helpful.
Anybody want to commit to potential low-hanging fruit?
This maybe is too specific, but after hearing these conversations, the presentations, part of me in the thought about applying the precautionary principle, I'm left wondering, like, how much would it cost for us to just like do reverse osmosis on all public water supplies and just get rid of everything? And then, like, yeah, and like, how much would that cost, and how does that cost compare to like not doing anything and then treating things specifically and allowing, especially in the context of MAR, where we're like replenishing groundwater and then now we're like contaminating larger water supplies, like, and I think that's something that could be probably done like within a year's time. But that kind of gets to my earlier thing of like how much, like what is the cost of doing something that's preventative or that's instead of like measuring the problem and then trying to like fix it later. But.
I mean, for your reverse osmosis question, my first question is like, they have, you know, depending on your level of users, there is a water quality. So you match the water quality with level of users. So you do reverse osmosis, remove everything, then you run into a problem of like, you might have to remineralize, add in, right, you know, things. So then you create another problem, but then you solve. So then, to me, you have to think about the target application and the water quality requirement. If you gonna be, you know, using water to irrigate a golf course versus,
Yeah,
you
drinking
know,
water.
yeah. So you really have to think about the how the quality of the water affect the intended users. That will determine the level of treatment technology, what you can, you know, so it becomes really difficult to have one size fits all. That's why it's very difficult to really treat water.
Yeah, but like if like even the concept of like applying it on a golf course or like, you know, at a wastewater treatment plant, like just going to secondary, like there are all these things that we don't know what the yeah, it's like what if we just went all the way to RO and we are just like preventing all these other side effects, and like how much would that cost? Would it be feasible? And like if you talk to anyone at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, like they're like desalinization is the future, and it's making like the cost of groundwater access, like for instance in the Central Valley, imported water is like $1,000 or $2,000 per acre foot for farmers. But instead, like before, they would like blend their groundwater that's saline with surface water. But instead of doing that, a lot of them are starting to transition towards desalinization plants on their farms to desalinate brackish groundwater. And it's like $500 per acre foot, which is on the grand scheme of like the cost of water supply, it's like on the order of like water conservation versus like ocean desalinization is like, you know, upwards of $3,000. So yeah, I just want to, I don't know, I just left thinking like, what if we just went all the way? What if we just did something that sounds kind of crazy, but how much would that cost? Would it even be feasible? And, you know, and then it's like a solution that could be presented in front of decision makers that they could work with.
So find the upper limit or the maximum.
Yeah, like what is it gonna take to like really like prevent all these things that we've been talking about?
So you mentioned inland desalination. That's great, but if you
Okay,
go
you know, I was
ask
gonna take it in a
somebody.
completely
Oh,
different
go ahead.
direction, So we can.
Okay, let's go to Neil, then
Yeah,
We
Neil.
just have a completely different,
Yes,
we
another idea.
should think about a different set of things that we
Okay.
heard. There's a lot of new measurement or missing measurements that we've talked about, but there's also a lot of data harmonization or vast piles of data that may be usable or not usable, and we did not address at all, aside from your comments about editing the PowerPoint, the opportunities for generative AI to play a role in that, and I
Yeah.
think there's a huge opportunity to connect with some of the cutting edge or soon to be cutting edge data analysis tools to approach the fragmented data system that we already have and parse it for information that can get a lot of these conversations started that have been historically difficult with a lot of man hours and
Mhm.
I was gonna go in a different direction, just say, let's fund like 4 pre-docs for a year to get us a good data set, to like take all of those county level, local data sets that is hard for each individual researcher to compile and create like a public good.
This is
And
competition.
look at how many
Yes.
grad students work on deforestation
deeper
after the
counts.
Hansen data set, or how many people work on housing prices because we have parcel level prices. If you can like generate entire branches of the literature with a new data set, I don't trust generative AI enough to deal with the messiness that is water quality
We
data.
just have generative AI compete with the.
That's what I'm saying, yeah, this is a head-to-head, we'll put some data scientists on one side.
That's kind of what we have pre-docs and then
The students will just go and use the.
Work 18 hours a day.
But I do, but regardless, I think either way.
I don't even know how to spell reverse osmosis.
Well, there's 2 words, that's the first thing.
And then everything. Yes.
That was one of the best news stories from this meeting, actually. that Reverse osmosis treats PFAS. Like that was, to me, that was one of the best news stories.
So just a word of caution, when you use reverse osmosis for inland desalination, that's great there. Then the regulator will ask you, okay, what are you going to do with the brine? You know, reverse osmosis generates brine. And when you in the ocean, you can dump the brine, right? But inland, this is the major problem because you have to put now the brine into this evaporation pond or, you know, deep injection. And then we've got some of those evaporation ponds then get to a point where the salt start being aerosolized. So what I'm really saying, when you do this solution for water, you have to do a life cycle analysis, really. So without doing a life cycle analysis, we don't really know what's going to work. So that's something to keep in mind as we do these things. Cradle to grave. When you treat water, you're gonna have to deal with the residuals. And then, so all of that. And then maybe Neil, no question about data. Do we include toxicity, endpoint, water quality? I mean, where do we stop, I guess, collecting data? I mean, what is enough?
We never stop collecting data.
So do we include toxicity, right? I mean, is it part of
what?
About these like emerging contaminants, like what drove PFAS regulation is toxicity.
I was thinking of a different kind of toxicity when you were talking about generative AI.
Yeah. Oh no, okay, yeah. I have some other things about generative AI that are toxic, but that's not the discussion here. It's like, at the end of the day, water quality, like PFAS regulation. Why PFAS came? Because there was some toxic endpoint, right? That got to a point where the data was overwhelming to say, well, at least we need to protect people from drinking water consumption, right? So then when I look at nitrate, for example, so nitrate, I mean, the human toxicity is not really the driver, it's the ecotoxicity, right? So then where in the water quality endpoint impact, do we need to consider all of that? I mean, it's just starting to become a huge data, curation things. Where do we stop? Or maybe we just go on. I mean, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud.
That's what we're doing right now. Yeah.
So in thinking about like cross-cutting idea, I mean, this workshop itself, kind of the key idea there in terms of measurement is a cross-cutting idea. And so you could almost think of having something where it's focused on measurement broadly, and then you could divide that, it seems like, into like 3 buckets, and I'm sure I'm gonna miss one, so I apologize if I miss someone's bucket, but one bucket would be the environment, right? So that would be improved measures of surface water, drinking water quality. Another bucket, and that could have like remote sensing, generative AI, field scale type of monitoring improvements. Another bucket would be institutions, and that then would be, thinking a bit more about how do we better measure those institutions and how they relate to the environment. And a third bucket, I think, would be economic actors, and so that would both be the sources of pollution, the people, the behaviors that are impacted by that pollution. So it would be like human health, recreation, housing, those kinds of things, as well as you could, if you wanted to group both water quality and quantity together, we heard a lot about like need for improvement on the data of water use. And so I think that again, just to kind of summarize about cutting that cross-cutting, I really love the fact that this workshop then is on measurement more broadly, because it does seem like it's a cross-cutting theme. And then you can get at some of these other important issues, even though they might vary across space, they might be a little bit different in the East than they are in the West. You're still focused on similar kind of measurement issues.
I will still push that more measurement and modeling. At the end of the day, if you're going to put these things, you're going to have to integrate measurement and model, pretty much.
Yes, I'm sorry, please.
Well, I want to pick up on that last point. I think I wouldn't put it as moral. I see what you're saying. It's value trade-offs. I think we would use the word value trade-offs. But one thing I notice in the energy world that I don't see in water as much is these pathways models that they have, which give to decision makers various options. So given the point about the heterogeneity of these water problems across the regions and the areas, I don't know that there would be a global pathways model, but it seems to me what you need is a pathways model at the scale of a watershed, where you say, okay, you need to provide high quality water at a certain supply. Here are your different options.
ranging from zoning to water markets to, you know, because we haven't talked enough about land use. Land use is absolutely critical to the way, and there are different ways of doing land use, and zoning is often the key part of that. And that can affect both the pollutants that go into the water because of where you put commercial establishments, et cetera. But I think, you know, vegetation management, which was sort of brought up by that last paper that Hope and John Lalonde have been working on, I think that's a critical issue. Because in some places it could be that you want to maintain more flexibility in the West because of drought management, and so you want to have some low-value crops that can be made fallow, but in other areas where you want to have permanent crops, you may not make sense to do them in areas of the West, which is sort of an implication of what John Morgan's getting at. So I just think we don't have that kind of planning tool. It's not, now these tools, by the way, you never really realize them the way they put it on paper. So this notion that we're going to get to 2045, you know, and be net zero, that's probably bullshit. But the point is, how far you fall from the ideal is really, you know, where we should be looking at things. But we should have at least some ideal of how, and some choices. And I think if you just give an isolated recommendation in one area or this, and not a sort of how did these different pieces come together, I think it's going to be very hard to get movement in that's going to make a difference, because there are too many interrelated pieces. And so I think from the energy world, I think we should borrow this idea of doing these planning tools, even though they make assumptions about human behavior, which we're going to have to keep modifying. So it's not just one plan, it's kind of a Bayesian sort of approach where you have a start point of what an ideal plan would be, and then you see where the behavior is screwing up, and then you say, well, what are our alternatives? I think it's that kind of dynamic planning tool is what you need in the watershed cases.
Great. That's a great suggestion. Okay. Well, we are at 12:15, so we will stop here. And I just wanted again to thank everyone for coming, and I would just like to say that unlike what Jean Laurent said a few minutes ago, I think the issue is not if we reconvene, it's when. Because I do think this has been a very productive meeting, and again, I think we've learned a lot, and I think we'll have to figure out how we reconvene either in this group or in smaller groups in the future to carry this conversation forward. So again, thank you all for coming, and lunchtime.